Hey everybody, it's me, Scott from Heroic Studios Gaming, coming at you once again with another video. I am mixing up the videos this month. I hope that you don't mind. I decided to go ahead and do the RPG review video first, which I usually do at the end of the month. But the reason I'm doing that is because today I'm talking about Dungeons & Dragons. I'll just literally Dungeons & Dragons today. And while it isn't my favoriteest system in the world, and there's reasons, and I'll sort of talk about that later. I did want to didn't want to make it seem biased, and I wanted to give it some justice. And so, in all of the other game RPGs that I review, I tend to talk about the history of the company that made it. And so, because I talk about the history of the company and I get deep into that, I didn't want to not do that for Dungeons & Dragons. So I knew that I was going to have to do probably the longest video that I'll ever make. And so heads up, if you're a minute in, and this is probably going to be the longest video I've ever made before, because Dungeons & Dragons has the longest history out of every RPG, and it's kind of a convoluted one as well. But the history of Dungeons & Dragons and the history of TSR, the original company that created it, is actually the history of RPGs as kind of a whole, because they paved the way for a lot of other companies. So it's a history that's sort of entangled with the concept of a tabletop RPG in general. So I mean, I just needed to I felt like it would be unjust of me not to cover those things while talking about the game. So warning, long video. All right, let's keep watching. So today I'm going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. Show this book again. I don't have just the Player's Handbook. I also have up on my shelf. It's weird because I'm like, this is not my favorite system, but I obviously have the Player's Handbook, but I also have the DMG, and I have the Curse of Strahd book, and I have the Monster Manual, and I've got a couple of other books that are third-party supplements to go with it, like Corio Halls, and I can't remember the name of it entirely, but the Dreaded Accursed. I've got a whole bunch of modules, and on my computer in digital format, I've got even more stuff. I've got Xanthar's Guide to Everything, and other books so. But despite the fact that I'm saying this isn't my favorite RPG ever, I do have those things because a lot of people play it. Because unfortunately, and as much as I like to pretend that Maximum Apocalypse is more popular than Dungeons & Dragons, it isn't. But Dungeons & Dragons is the world's most popular RPG, based entirely upon its sales and its market share of tabletop RPGs, right? Because if you want to say it's the most popular tabletop RPG of America, you'd be right, but it isn't the most popular tabletop RPG in Japan. It's actually the third or fourth in Japanese ratings. So it isn't exactly what it says, but it is still pretty popular. And I made a bunch of notes, but I just looked down and I can see that my notes got screwed up by a small puppy that stepped on my keyboard. Not that I have a puppy, but someone else, and their dog ended up walking across my keyboard when I was typing out these notes. But anyway, all right, so let's just jump right in. Let's jump into the history of Dungeons & Dragons, and then we'll talk about my reasons that I like or dislike it. So if you hate videos on YouTube where you have to watch 20 minutes of stuff before you finally get to the thing you want to see, well, that's what this is. So sorry, let's just move on. So Dungeons & Dragons came out in 1984. It came out in 1984, and it was originally some spiral-bound kind of loose papers thing that was sort of put in manila envelopes and shipped out of Gary Gygax's basement. Or Don K's basement. I can't remember which one of their basements it was shipped out of, but it was shipped out of a basement. I read The Dungeon Master, which is a graphic novel story of Gary Gygax, and it was good, but I found out when I was doing research for this particular video that it wasn't entirely the full story. It was missing whole bits of stuff. In fact, it skipped a whole bunch of really important stuff right at the end of Gary Gygax's tenure at TSR. That I really wish it hadn't, because it turned out to be actually some really crazy, convoluted political stuff. But anyway, let's move on. So it came out in 1984. Prior to that, Gary Gygax, Ernest Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons & Dragons, well, one of the creators of Dungeons & Dragons, he had been making a set of rules for miniature war games that used, little tin men that they would fight each other, and it was quite popular at that time of the 60s and 70s. And the miniature war game rules that he was creating was based off of someone else's rules, but he sort of took them and built on them, and it was called Chainmail. And Chainmail was these rules for fantasy armies fighting, well, not fantasy, sorry, medieval armies fighting, these medieval battles. But at the back of Chainmail, he included this sort of one sheet fantasy rules in case you wanted to, do that, because he was a fan of Tolkien and he wanted to actually make fantasy rules, but he wasn't entirely sure that it would go. So he just kind of threw it in, see if it would actually take. It kind of did. So Dave Arneson was an entirely different guy, right? Not related to Gary Gygax. They may have had some brief interactions with each other, but they really didn't know each other that well. But he was working on a wargaming system where you, instead of taking armies, like, Warhammer 40k style, where you have a bunch of armies and stuff, or Warhammer style, instead of having these armies and fighting each other, you instead had individual characters, and he called his game Blackmoor, and he wanted to sort of make it a little bit more individualistic, and so he took the rules for chainmail and used those to resolve combat between characters in his game Blackmoor. But he also added to that. He also created like a system for leveling up the characters so they became more powerful. And he came up with rules for so he came up with like XP and level advancements, right? And then he also came up with the rules for armor class. And then he had to like individualize these characters, so he gave them special abilities, which formed into classes or whatever. But because he was doing all of this, somebody, when the Lake Geneva Convention, which is now called Gen Con, was held in 1973, so before the release of Dungeons and Dragons. Somebody introduced the two of them, put them together in the same room, was like, hey, listen, Dave is using your system, Gary, to like do this game that he's kind of creating. And the two of them just started talking, and they hit it off. They talked about Blackmoor, and they talked about the possibilities of where that could go, which led them to go ahead and create this game that we now know as Dungeons and Dragons. So they sort of came up with this stuff, and essentially they were like passing ideas back and forth, and Dave Arneson was essentially the ideas guy, and then Gary Gygax was like the writer guy, right, who wrote it all down and codified it. And so they had this idea, and they sort of presented it to groups of people, and inevitably it was the names were sort of thrown out there. And it's urban legend is that it was Gary Gygax's wife who called it Dungeons and Dragons, because she said this game has a lot of dungeons and a lot of dragons. And then that idea, that name stuck with his daughter, Cindy, and she was like super into that. She was like 4, and she was super into the idea of this Dungeons and Dragons game, the name of it. So that's how it stuck. That's the urban legend. I don't know if any of that's true, but that's the urban legend for it. But that's how it was created. It was obviously influenced by Tolkien, but they've influenced the magic system that they created in the original Dungeons and Dragons is actually influenced by the Dying Earth series by Jack Vance. So they were like big nerds, and they were big into reading and stories and stuff. But they wanted to sell this game, so they started trying to sell it, but they realized that, much like everyone else, much like I did, in order to sell these things, you kind of have to create a company, and in order to create a company, you kind of need some seed money, and so they couldn't just do Kickstarter back then, so they needed to find money somehow, so they invited, so to be fair, it wasn't Gary and Dave Arneson that wanted to create a company. It was Gary Gygax knew that he needed to create a company to sell his product, and he and his friend Don Kay, who was helping him with chainmail and other stuff, was like, yeah, let's do this, and they were like, let's create a company, and they needed seed money to do that. So they brought in a friend whose name was Brian Bloom. They brought in a friend named Brian Bloom because Dave Arneson was not willing to do this company with them. So they created Tactical Study Rules, Inc., known as TSR, in 1974, and that's how they started sort of distributing Dungeons & Dragons. In fact, this Brian Bloom guy he's the one that he funded the first print run of this game called Dungeons & Dragons, which was 1,000 copies that they sent out to people, and it took them 10 months to sell out of the 0 edition. I'm calling it 0 edition, which I'll clarify later when we start talking about editions, because it's 0/1 edition, but it's 0 edition D&D, but it cost $10 to get the box set, and it was sort of a box set. It wasn't really a box set. It was just the thing in an envelope, right? But they said in 10 months they sold out. So then they used that money. They printed another 1,000, which is their second print run of 0 edition, and that sold out in 6 months. So they were like, holy crap, this is going somewhere. And so in 1975, they did a third run of 2,000, and they sold out in 5 months. So they were printing more, and they were selling out faster. And that's sort of what created this craze where they realized this was a thing. Because they now sold 4,000 copies in like the first year and a half. And that's it. They just sold 4,000 copies in a year and a half. I haven't even sold close to that with Beta Red. So I think we have sold close to that for Maximum Apocalypse, or have sold that if you separate. We definitely have if you separate each book individually, but as a set, I don't know if we've sold more than 3,000 and a half, like 3,500 or something. But anyway, So they realized they needed to expand though in '75. So they kept using all this money, and they actually bought like an office, and they got like an editor, and they created the real thing that was Dungeons and Dragons, and they started developing different stuff for it. And this is where this sort of 0 edition to first edition thing sort of comes about, because they do clean it up a little bit. That's what I'm going to say. In 1977, they created the Grey Hawk setting, which was like they're now having a setting for this game, so people didn't have to make them up. They also they used Dave Arneson's Blackmore setting. And to be fair, like while he wasn't involved in the actual company, he was getting royalties from all the things that were coming out of the company. And so he was, they could do things like take his setting and use it. So they created the Blackmore and Greyhawk settings, which they started running as like the base settings. And then they started running tournaments at Gen Con. And then, to sort of dredge up interest for this. And then they also had adventure modules. They created the Dragon magazine so they could just continue to pump. They just sort of grew. And then they created the well-known supplement, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, which is, while it's not like everybody knows about it, but if you don't know about it, you should go look into it. It had some really good information about these things, and the way that they were set up in the early days, it was way cooler than the way that it kind of is now, and definitely after the Satanic Panic, like it was different. But anyway, let's look at my notes. Where am I at? 1977. Okay, so 1977, they had all of this stuff, and they had this big pile of all of these things that they've been creating, all these different articles for Dragon Magazine. And they had the different tournaments, the modules, the settings, all of these things. And they realized, Don Kay and Gary Gygax, they realized that they basically had to do something about their company. It was kind of getting bloated. They needed to do something to sort of put this all back together. And so they realized they had two options. They could either, simplify and streamline everything and call that first edition, which is kind of what Mothership is doing over there. They could do that. Or they could take all of these extra things that they've created, all of this extraneous stuff, and sort of put it all together and compile it into one book, and then that would be Dungeons and Dragons. They chose to do both. So for those of you who don't know the history and who aren't around, they actually chose to do both, and they created the basic Dungeons and Dragons, which is the streamlined, simplified rules that just sort of covered like the basic races and the basics of how to play the game, and left out a lot of the complicated busyness of like armor and all these different things. It sort of just was a streamlined, semi-role-playing, more improv style game. And then they also created Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which generally people consider the second edition of Dungeons & Dragons, but that's not true. In fact, now that they had the box set of Basic, and then the compiled book of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, they had two separate editions sort of happening at the same time. So that's where it gets confusing about this first edition, 0 edition thing, because you couldn't say that Basic was first edition and Advanced was second edition like people tend to think. People who know a little bit more than that will think that second edition AD&D was second edition Dungeons & Dragons, but still not accurate. We'll get into that in a second. But essentially, there were two separate editions going on, and that's where you would have, say, first edition of both, right? And they were essentially different games, but the same basic system. So that's what they did. Basic D&D, like I said, had basic races, focused on role-playing, was improv, simple and fun. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was deeper, more advanced combat rules, special races, things for building keeps and communities. I totally remember reading that one from my dad's stuff when I was a kid. Evil races, complex magic spells, everything. And it was a more structured style of play. It wasn't the loosey-goosey, free-formy, improv style stuff that kind of goes with rules light systems these days. It was the polar opposite. It was a crunchy system. So they had a crunchy system and a rules light system at the same time. The two systems of Dungeons & Dragons actually sort of stayed separate from each other until 1997 when it was bought by Wizards of the Coast. So just note right now that this was 20 years of these basically concurrent systems rolling next to each other. So it gets hard to determine what was first and second edition Dungeons & Dragons. But we kind of we know when the system became third edition. That's basically what I'll say right now. So anyway, they created these two different systems. They rolled with it. Let's see, where am I at? Notes. Totally got all that. I'm way over here now. So there was, during this time, so now that they had this stuff, these two things, they just got really big. They got bigger and bigger. But some stuff was going on with the business, and I'll talk about that in a second. But they got bigger and bigger, and they were doing things. They started kind of going into like global distribution, and they started going after knockoff games or competitors. So like this is the same time that like slightly after this, so like 1980-ish, that Call of Cthulhu was made, that RuneQuest was made, that Chivalry and Sorcery was made, and these were competitors to Dungeons & Dragons, and they kind of had to deal with Dungeons & Dragons trying to kick them out. But that was all happening at this time because now they had these two different editions and stuff. But, so let's talk about the stuff going on at the company. Inside TSR, there grew to be a lot of political and financial tension because Don Kay died in 1977. He passed away, and that left his shares of the company, his third of the company, which is, between Gary's third, his third, and the third that went to Brian Bloom, who was essentially financing all of this business. His shares were sort of up for grabs. And the father of Brian Bloom, who was actually the one financing, because Brian Bloom apparently didn't have the money himself. He was sort of taking it from daddy's money, right? He, the money that was coming, so the dad, he gets involved and he buys those shares and gives them over to his other son. I think his name was Kevin or something. So Brian Bloom and Kevin Bloom, they're called the Bloom brothers in history from this point forward because they basically did everything together. The Bloom brothers then are now financially in charge of the company because they own something like 66 to 69% of the company. They own 70% of the company, and that was their shares, right? So Gary Gygax, he just wanted to create cool stuff, so he just kind of let them take over and run the company so he could just sit back and like make cool settings, cool ideas. He decided to start working on the D&D cartoon that some of us are aware of. He started making a D&D movie, but he worked on supplements, and he had these different articles in Dragon Magazine. He was doing conventions. He was having a good old time just being himself. But the Bloom brothers, they did all kinds of really crazy business with the money and ended up taking TSR as a business into debt, something like $1.5 million into debt, because they were doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Literally, they bought tons of cars. They funded a bunch of stuff. And they even tried to I think from what I remember from reading, and I'm not entirely sure this is true, this might be an urban legend again, but they apparently tried to unearth a sunken pirate ship to use as this sort of talking piece essentially about the company. So they basically just drove it into the ground, which, created a whole bunch of problems, and they had to lay off something like 75% of the company, leaving just a skeleton crew of designers and developers. But it was enough that it caused Gary Gygax to get involved again and be more involved in the business side of his business rather than the creative side of his business. And the story is that he tried to fight them in court to say that that when Don Kay died, the shares were supposed to go to him according to Don's will, but a judge didn't buy it, and so he was like, nah, and so that didn't happen. So that just sort of fell apart. But the Bloom brothers also couldn't realize they couldn't remain in charge of the company because everybody who'd been fired, everyone who still remained, knew that the reason that the other people had all been fired was because these guys mismanaged the money, and so they decided to leave TSR. They just had to go because they couldn't stay around. So they sold all of their shares to one person. She was an office manager. They sold all their shares to her, and her name was Lorraine Williams. And her story in TSR and Dungeons & Dragons is really complicated because on the one side, she was a terrible person to be running a gaming company, a terrible person to be running a game company called Dungeons & Dragons during the 80s, during the Satanic Panic. She was the worst. But on the other side of that, on the flip side of that same story, the other hand, she's also the one that pulled the company out of debt and made it sustainable for a while, and got it to actually become the popularity that we know. So it's like a double-edged sword in her story. She's primarily the one responsible for making us know about it, really, and but also the same one who sort of drove it downwards again and really kind of took away all the spice that it had and turned it into just this sort of boiled soup, as it were. But anyway, so Lorraine, she became the head of the company, and when she became the head of the company, when she bought the shares, Gary Gygax again tried to go after these shares, right? He was like, nah, I need to get these. And so he tried to sue and say that they didn't have the right to do that. They had to sell it to him rather than to just some random person. And again, it failed. Once again, the courts were like, no, that's not how it works. They can sell it to whomever they want. So she ended up with the shares, and he, realizing that she was going to push him out because he knew who she was, he knew what she was going to want to do with the company, he just sold her his shares, and she became 100% in charge of the company. And so that's when he left and he walked away. He just ditched, right? And he was just like, I'm out. He actually went and tried to. He still liked creating games. He was still a creator at heart. So he actually went and tried to start another game company called GWC. Like, I don't remember what that stands for, but he started GWC, and Lorraine Williams and TSR just like sort of trounced it. They just smashed it on the ground, sued him for copyrights and all kinds of other stuff, and then just like it disappeared. Like the company just sank. But that's not the complicated piece of the story I was going to tell you about. No, so Lorraine Williams, who's now in charge of TSR, is as of 1980 something or other, 84, 85, somewhere in that neighborhood. She's in charge of the company. She is actually a devout Christian who believed in sort of the rhetoric of the Satanic Panic, even though it wasn't really in gear when she took over, but the more in gear it got, the more she believed it. She had some really strange views on games in general, and she sort of believed that all the people who play tabletop role-playing games are socially inept people who live in their parents' basements. That was what one YouTuber who described the history of Dungeons and Dragons called it. And I looked into it, and it did seem like she didn't really like gamers in general. She just didn't think that they were productive people, which is weird that she's in charge of a game company, but she didn't intend to, right? She was just an office manager who was working for the game company and then like got in charge of it. But anyway, she one thing she didn't like was playtesting. So she just hated playtesting because she thought that it was an excuse for people to get paid to play games, to sit around a table and play games instead of doing actual work. So at this time, when TSR changed over to Lorraine Williams, that's when we have a lot of the sort of unequal power structures and unbalanced gaming stuff that started coming out, because she just didn't believe in testing. So people just were like, well, here's my idea for a thing, and it's like, good, let's print it up and put it in a book and send it out. But in 1989, she decided to come out with the second edition of AD&D, the second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which is the second edition of what's what everyone considers the official second edition of Dungeons & Dragons, but that's false. Because actually, in 1981, they revamped the basic box set. They revamped it, changed it, made it nicer and smoother and cleaner. They took away some things and they added some things. And so technically, Basic, which was still going on in 1989 and continued to go until 1997, Basic got revamped and had a second edition of Basic in 1981. So if you want to count by editions based on chronology, technically the revamped version of Basic was the second edition of Basic. And also at the same time, before 1989, there was some advancement to the Basic rules called Expert Rules. And Expert Rules, when did that come out? I think that actually came out in 89 as well. So 89 saw AD&D second edition and expert sort of rules hit the table. And expert rules are sort of created by people like, I don't remember everyone that was involved, but I believe Monty Cook was one of the people that was involved, who also worked on the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons book. But he created the expert rules, which is why we have, if you're into the OSR scene, the old school Renaissance scene, there's the BX concept, BX D&D or old school D&D. That's actually what that is. It's basic expert, basic expert Dungeons & Dragons. And so Basic, by the way, is the foundation of basically all of the OSR and like the old school like gaming stuff. If you hadn't figured that out yet. Whereas AD&D was the progenitor of the modern gaming, crunchy gaming stuff that we have. So anyway, so she created AD&D second edition, and what she did is she removed all references to demons, devils, summoning, special spells, certain things. She got rid of all of the sexy art that could exist, anything that could be promiscuous in some way. She basically just like numbed the game down. She just lightened it up, and she turned it into and took away the sort of myth, or she wanted it to be like medieval sorcery, history. So history and mythology, no sorcery, no magic, no demons, no any of that business. And so it changed to be a game that was about like medieval history gaming, right? I didn't give myself water, so this video is going to be weird. Anyway, so that's what happened. So AD&D became like the version of AD&D that we know as second edition. Changed to be a lot lighter, and it wasn't quite as dark and cool. So that's why people started playing the other games. People started playing things like, Shadowrun and Call of Cthulhu and all of the other ones, are Pendragon. So that's when they started getting, more popular because Advanced Dungeons & Dragons sort of took away this, mystical horror stuff that was really cool. All right, so where are we? Yep, covered all that. Anyway, so Lorraine's way of running the company was the way that we typically understand that this is where the history of other RPGs comes in. The way she ran the company was the way that we all understand the way you're supposed to run a gaming company. And they would sort of create a setting, right, for a little while. They would create a setting, they would create a bunch of supplements that went with that setting, and then they would drop the setting for a new setting and a couple more supplements that went with that, drop that setting, etc. And they just keep repeating so that people had to keep coming back and buying new products. Now, that is basically what all gaming companies do these days. Every few years, you got to create supplements. Like every year or so, if you don't create something new for the company, then you might as well just give up. But that came from her. That was her business model, and that's what drove TSR out of the ground. Like it's what pulled them back up and pulled them back into being a solvent company. It worked. Everyone kept buying their stuff, and then people who wanted to play in a setting that wasn't supported anymore would have to go find it somewhere. There was resale value in your books, so you would buy them because you knew that later you could resell them. So it totally worked. Everyone bought into it, and they just fell right into her plan, and it just kept making money, which is sort of in this process is how we got things like the Ravenloft setting, the Dark Sun setting, the Spelljammer setting, the Forgotten Realms setting, and all of the other settings that exist for Dungeons and Dragons. That's where this came from, was this time frame of make it, support it, drop it, make the next one. She totally drugged them out of debt, but because of the way that she was sort of doing these things, the popularity kind of started to loosen a little bit, and that's when the popularity of World of Darkness started happening, where it started to grow there. Warhammer 40k and Warhammer Gaming came out, so Warhammer RPG essentially, and Warhammer 40k RPG came out with Rogue Trader. Shadowrun was growing in popularity, and so it was sort of changing in the scene. So in the mid-90s, things started to look not so good for TSR, but the main thing that happened in the mid-90s, if you may remember the gaming scene, was Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering took off, and this Wizards of the Coast, which was actually created by a guy who was a fan of Dungeons & Dragons. In fact, Wizards of the Coast is apparently the name of his gaming group, and then they turned it into a company. They were Wizards of the Coast, apparently. That game took off and became super popular, and everyone was playing it. So Lorraine thought, well, let's jump into this gaming thing. Let's have TSR create a dice game called Dragon Dice, and is a collectible card game, but it wasn't a card game. It was a collectible dice game, and it was fine. Apparently, it's a good game. Apparently, according to everyone who ever played it. But the problem was you can only collect so many dice, right? You can only collect so many dice, and so it was questionable whether you should keep buying dice. And so gaming companies that are gaming facilities, the game shops, would only carry so much of the inventory, and if it didn't move, then it didn't move, right? There was no reason to keep buying more inventory. And so what ended up happening was they made a whole bunch of these dice, and they didn't move. And so TSR sort of fell into this place where they didn't have the ability to dig themselves out anymore, and they had reached a standstill in the amount of products that they could sell. So they started losing money. And when they started losing money and things looked really grim, Wizards of the Coast, who was now high on all of their Magic the Gathering money, decided that they were going to, because the creator was a huge fan of Dungeons & Dragons, he bought all of the products. Now, he didn't buy TSR, which is very important to note, because there's a whole thing going on right now with the logo and label of TSR, who owns the brand, and all that business. You can look into that somewhere else, or maybe I'll talk about it if you want me to, what I know about it. But anyway, he just bought all the products. He bought Dragon Dice, he bought Dungeons & Dragons, he bought Basic, he bought AD&D, he bought the whole business. And every other thing that they were also coming out with. He bought all the settings. And so he bought all of those products, and TSR sort of floated off to go do its own thing, and it sort of went into limbo for a while, and somebody eventually bought the rights to using the logo and label, and they started creating stuff. But in 2000, so they bought that happened in 1997. So limped into 1997, sort of not really having anything, and then it was bought out by Wizards of the Coast. All the products were bought out, and they spent the first couple of years basically just letting everybody know, all the fans know, that they were there to take care of it, and they were going to do stuff with those things. So everyone who was a fan of D&D would know that the company, it would exist. The company wasn't going to go away, the game wasn't going to disappear, and it was still going to be produced. So then in 2000, Wizards of the Coast released the revamped version of Dungeons & Dragons, in which they combined both the two basic and advanced Dungeons and Dragons into one book, which they called third edition. And so that's how we have third edition. So that's where we know the third edition exists, because we know that it came out in 2000 by Wizards of the Coast. And it was essentially the culmination of trying to mix the basic rules with the more complex rules to play it. That was pretty good. I mean, lots of people liked it, but they did release, like 3 years later, they released 3.5, which is the one that basically everybody remembers. If you're like a modern gamer these days, you probably played third or 3.5. You played D&D back in the day. If you're like really new and you've only been with like D&D since 4th or 5th edition, this is news to you. But there was a 3 and a 3.5 edition, and all the things that came out after 3.5 came out, referenced 3.5 and said forget about 3, but it's not really a separate edition. It was really just a remodeling, like fixing of small problems in third edition rules. And that was really good. It went on until 2008. It was fully supported until 2008. So that was 8 years of progress, which is strange because the others had like 20 years. But in 2008, the company was realizing that there's like a plateau for gaming stuff. And so the Wizards of the Coast realized that there's a plateau in which they start to, like, RPGs start to lose popularity and people don't buy them anymore, so they have to reinvigorate them with some, just put like money in the veins somehow. And so they decided to create in 2008. They started working on and then finally released they did release it in 2008, the 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which is the worst edition of Dungeons & Dragons ever made. I'm not the only one who thinks this. Is my opinion about Dungeons & Dragons in general, but like 4th edition was the worst, and there's reasons why I didn't like it, but it seems like everyone else agreed with me. I mean, I'll just tell you right now, I didn't like 4th edition because it basically felt like World of Warcraft, the RPG. Like it was like the classes all kind of felt the same. They just felt like they'd reorganized them for no reason. And because you had these like per day uses of abilities, right? Like even if you were a fighter, you're a fighter, you can only slam somebody with your shield 2 times a day or something like that. Like it was ridiculous, like this way that it worked out, and it felt like a battle simulator and not a role playing game. And so I was not super impressed with it. And I wasn't the only one. I was not the only one who didn't like 4th edition D&D. In fact, 4th edition D&D was basically so hated that everyone just kept playing 3rd edition. And also when they made 4th edition, they removed their open gaming license, so third parties who were sort of creating stuff for Dungeons & Dragons couldn't make any more third-party stuff, and that pissed some people off. In fact, so many people were mad at the open gaming license thing and the 3.5 not being the game, like 4th edition sucking, that a company that you might know named Paizo decided that they were going to go create their own version of 3.5 because they were a third-party vendor, so they totally knew what they were doing, and they basically just ripped off the whole thing, and they created Pathfinder, which you may or may not have heard of before. So there was this nebulous time frame in which there was a 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons and nobody was really playing it, and that's when games like Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, Shadowrun, that's when they became the most popular. If you look at their history, they're really popular. They like their popularity spikes starting around 2008 and it just shoots up until 2012 or 2013. That's why. That's actually the reason why. So this is the history of gaming. The reason is because Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition sucked so much. Well, it wasn't that it sucked so much. It was just so disliked, so unpopular that people just started being like, well, what else is out there? What else can I play? And they found Savage Worlds and they found, everything else out there. And they realized that that's when a lot of the modern gamers, the older modern gamers, people who started in the 2000s like myself, totally was like, let's try all of these other systems, because Dungeons & Dragons just definitely wasn't doing it for most people. So because and Wizards of the Coast recognized it. Wizards of the Coast realized that they had screwed up, and starting in 2012, so only 4 years after they'd released 4th edition, they started working on what they called D&D Next, which later got released as D&D 5th edition. That's right. So 5th edition it came out basically in 2014. So 6 years after they released 4th edition, they created 5th edition, and it's been that way since 2014. So it's been 8 years now, or yes, eight years now, and we haven't changed it, right? So obviously 4th edition was terrible, and everyone moved on. But they play tested it, and they actually did a lot of play testing to see what people wanted. They teased some things, and it came out in 2014, but it was still like people were still a little bit worried about it. In fact, I know I was when I heard that it came out. I was like, who cares? But people were a little bit leery because 4th edition sucked so much. But in 2015, a little known actor named Vin Diesel went on to a show on a stream called Geek and Sundry, and did an adventure with some little known voice actor named Matt Mercer, and they did an episode of, or a session of Dungeons and Dragons. And that's what kicked off the current trend that we have of people understanding, like, the idea that rich, good-looking, well-made social people could play Dungeons and Dragons, and kicked off the trend that we know of, like Celebrity D&D, Adventure Zone, Critical Role, all that stuff. That started in 2015, and that was a publicity stunt to make the game popular, and it worked. After that, it just ushered in this whole thing that we know of the current popularity of Dungeons & Dragons. And in 2019, according to the Wizards of the Coast estimates, in 2019 there were 14 million fans, players of Dungeons & Dragons. I have the books, so I'm counted in that category. If you have the books, you're counted in that category as well. There were 14 million people who played it. And so it, to date, is the highest selling RPG, and has pretty much kind of been the most highest selling RPG in the world forever. So that's why it can have the tagline, the world's most popular RPG, because it is. So 35 minutes into this video, I finally finished the history of Dungeons & Dragons and where we are today versus where it started in 1974 as this sort of wargaming thing. And now I can tell you about why I why I dislike Dungeons & Dragons. Let's do the pros first. Like, what is good about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition if you don't already know? If you're watching this and you don't already know, well, let me explain. So what's good about it is it's a very simplified system. It's approachable, right? It's an approachable, simple system that has these layers of complexity that you could dig into if you really want to. Some complicated stuff you can do with certain feats and things. It's got complexity to it, but overall it's just kind of a simple roll a d20, add a number to it. If that number beats a difficulty, then you succeeded, right? It's a very simple system. It's not the most simple system, but it is a simple system and is very approachable. It's also, very well done if you like fantasy stuff, so it's like thing. So it's codified, and it's easy to interpret. It's very clear what you should do. It has some great writing. It has wonderful, wonderful art. Lots and lots of good, beautiful art. And there's lots of third-party products that go with it. So if you're getting into it, you can totally buy up all kinds of stuff. I mentioned two of them earlier when I talked about stuff I have on my shelf. The Dreaded Curse is one of the best books if you like horror monsters, if you like ghosts, goblins, liches, and stuff like that. The Dreaded Curse is great. It is a third-party product, but I love the hell out of it. And then there's also like dice bags and accoutrement. There's dice and bags and dice bags and accoutrement that go along with being a D&D player. There's miniatures, there's maps, there's puzzle pieces, there's all kinds of stuff, coloring books, so there's all kinds of stuff to go along with it. That's what's cool about Dungeons & Dragons. Those are the pros of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, Dungeons & Dragons in general. Now, and there's the tie-in with Magic the Gathering. If you like Magic the Gathering, there's also the tie-in with that. But now let's talk about why I don't like it. 37 minutes and 45 seconds in. We're finally getting to why it's not my most favorite system. If you're still here, great. Thank you for staying. If you're here, if you watched this in pieces, which I don't blame you if you did. If you watched this is great. You're finally here. Let's talk about it. So there are basically 6 things that I dislike about Dungeons & Dragons, and this is why I give it like 1 thumb up. I'll just tell you that right in advance. I give it 1 thumb up instead of 2. I would give it 2, except for these 6 things that I dislike. Thing number 1, combat in Dungeons & Dragons is boring. Somebody is probably really offended at me right now, but it is boring. There's some ways to make it a little bit more interesting with like some other stuff that you do, but for the most part, it's essentially a game of whack-a-mole, and where your dice determine whether or not you beat this arbitrary armor class number, and then which is the defense of the enemy, right? And eventually, it boils down to attrition. Can I whack enough of the other player, the enemy's life points down, their health points down, before they do to me, right? It becomes a game of whack-a-mole. I hit you, you hit me, I hit you, you hit me, I hit you, you hit me, and this is how our combat goes. It's super boring, in my opinion. There's lots of better ways to handle it. Since I started with Shadowrun, I know that there were better ways to handle it, so when I was introduced to Dungeons & Dragons, I was like, this is boring. So from the very beginning, I was like, this combat system sucks. But whatever. And it just gets worse as you get higher in level. As you get higher, the CR rating of your monsters get higher, there's more hit points. There's more hit points on the table, so there's more whack-a-moling going on. So it doesn't get any better. It doesn't get any better as you get higher levels. It just kind of stays the same. Let's see. So related to combat class, right? Or related to combat, there's the armor class. Related to that, there's difficulty class, or the DC of actions. So actions that you take that are non-combat related also have a difficulty number that's an arbitrary number that floats out there in the universe somewhere. In fact, it's actually more arbitrary than the number for armor class. Armor class at least has an equation to determine what the armor class is, whereas the difficulty class of things is really just determined by your dungeon master. They just kind of pick a number out of thin air, and that's your difficulty number. And I find that to be not great. I know there's other systems that do it. I'm not trying to say and the other systems that do it, I also don't like those as much, right? Like those are things that I dislike about those systems as well. I kind of feel like games should have like an intrinsic point in which you know that there's success. Games that say like if you get a 4 or higher, you succeed, or if you get a 7 through 8, like you get a success with a complication. But then if you get an 8 or a 9 or above, it's a perfect success. Those things, wonderful. I love those. Those are great. And I like that. I'm like, just yes, let's do that. Like the system for all of the free league stuff where you get 1-6 and you totally succeed in one of the actions. Wonderful. Let's have like a set thing like that. That's how I think games should be made. To have like an arbitrary number out there that just floats nebulously in space, and it's a secret number that I, the game master, I'm not going to tell you about, and let's see if you can magically hit my magic number. That's really dumb in my opinion. But because I've been a player on the side of the table where like I did something and I had like a 26 and I apparently still failed at something, and like everybody, including myself, all the players at the table kind of felt that the dungeon master was lying, but like we couldn't call him out on it because we didn't know what the DC number was for the particular thing. And then when he got pushed into it, he eventually said it was a 30 or something, right? So like to fail because I beat an arbitrary, or because I didn't beat an arbitrary floating number in space somewhere, bores the hell out of me. So that's another reason why I don't like Dungeons & Dragons. Next, third reason I don't like Dungeons & Dragons is because crafting is dumb. If you don't know the crafting system for Dungeons & Dragons, go look it up. It's literally pay some money and wait some time. It is dumb. There's no level of skill that makes you better at it. There's no way to speed it up unless I think you pay more money or something. Like, it's dumb. Dumb crafting system. Don't like it. Moving on. Character advancements in Dungeons & Dragons is fine. It's great. There's XP, and then the XP, you reach a certain point, you go up in a level. Sometimes the XP can feel arbitrary, just like the difficulty numbers. It sort of feels weird sometimes. And that's why there's actually a lot of game masters who skip to things like milestones or other things in the story where it makes sense that you leveled up. But at least you level up and you have these advancement system. The downside of the advancement system, this is what I dislike, is that it's predetermined. There's some little bit of customization you can do for your character, but for the most part, your character is going to follow the path that the developers of the game decided was the path for your thing. And that might be because, well, you're a class, so you're going to do a certain thing a certain way, and you're going to develop a certain way. Fine, you might say that, and that's okay. That's fine that that's your argument. But the point that I'm making is that if you had a 20th level ranger and I had a 20th level ranger, I like rangers, so that's what I'm saying. 20th level ranger, 20th level ranger. Our 20th level rangers, while having some minor tweaks here, there, some differences, we're basically going to have the same kinds of special abilities, the same kinds of powers, the same kinds of spells, right? Like, we're not going to look any different from each other. We're going to be kind of indistinguishable, except for maybe I fight with 2 swords and you fight with a bow, and my favorite enemy is bugbears and your favorite enemy is kobolds. Like it's dumb. It's not really that customized, right? So unless you multi-class your character, you're essentially going to be the same, that you follow this progression that someone somewhere determined was the progression for your character when they leveled up. I find that to be dumb. In fact, Absolute Tabletop did it differently when they did their Harbinger stuff, and I really like the way they did it, where they like have these special abilities and things out there, and each time you get a new one, you reach a certain level, you get a new one, and you just go pick from the list. And so you could actually have 2 completely different characters who are in the same class. So, like, that's great. That's wonderful. That's a good way of doing it. I think that's a better way of doing it than the way that they typically do it. All right, so that's that. So now I'm on to number 5, the core Dungeons & Dragons setting, number 5 on my list. Core Dungeons & Dragons setting, Forgotten Realms, Faerun, is boring. It's boring. It's just a typical fantasy setting. It has towns, it has cities, it has some political stuff, but it's boring. But they do have good settings, so I'm not going to say all settings are bad. Just Faerun is boring. Like Ravenloft, like if you want to play Curse of Strahd or the Dark Sun setting, I'm totally down to play that. And I've been watching the Legend of Vox Machina, and like I know there's a Tal Doré setting. I would totally do that. I would do that setting. That sounds fun. That's very cool. But Forgotten Realms as a whole, boring as hell. So that's the thing that I dislike, and everyone plays in it because it's the base setting. You know, it's fine. Cool. Number 6, D&D is not lethal. I'm just gonna leave that out there. D&D is not lethal. You can argue with me all you want, but let's think about it. If you get hit, how do you heal? How do you deal with that? Well, first off, you've got friends who have magic healing. That's probably a thing that will help you out. If you don't have people with magic healing, you could also use potions that you might have, which are magical healing. But if you don't want to do that, after you finish the fight, you can just take a short rest and then roll a number of hit dice to see how many hit points you just get back. And if you really don't want to do that and you still want to heal, you can just have a long rest. And you're fine, right? So like this is what I'm getting at. Like there's D&D is not really lethal unless you like super mod it or homebrew it. There's a lot of ways to mitigate damage, and I think it's because of this whole attrition game that you just whack-a-mole on each other. So they have to have these like many different ways that you heal. But what it does turn into sometimes is that it becomes not great for non-traditional whack-a-mole type situations. So I was running a horror campaign, and nobody ever really got close to dying, which is really weird to say for a horror campaign since literally everything, the darkness was trying to kill them. Everything was trying to kill them all the time, when they slept, when they were awake, and yet somehow they were always managing to stay above it. And then finally, the first time I finally get them close to dying, the druid dropped some kind of thing where he could heal them 14, the whole party, everyone in the party, as long as they stayed within 30 feet, 14 points of damage every round. So I had to figure out how to throw at like 14 or more damage at characters constantly to sort of beat this whack-a-mole system that already existed. That just ruined it, right? And I mean, obviously we have this thing about like tone and whatever that goes into that, but the moral of the story that I'm making is that it's not as lethal as it might sound. It's just like a thing, and then even if you do whack-a-mole somebody down to where their points or their hit points are 0 and they're like unconscious, they're dying, they still have death throws, they still have death saves, and they can still get out of it. And I say this as playing a character. My second time playing Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, I played a first level character at a convention, and for whatever reason, lots of people at the convention wanted to sit at this table, and so we ended up, there's like 2 first level players because we were new, and then people brought their own characters, and so there was a bunch of 4th level people, and so we were playing in a 4th level dungeon because we had to, because of these 4th level dudes, ladies and dudes that were at this table. And because I was a first level character, I was on the brink of death like the whole 3 of the 4 hours of this convention game. And I was on the brink of death the whole time. I had like no hit points or just 1 hit point. And I had to make a bunch of death saving throws. And you know what didn't happen? I didn't actually die. I was being choked by some kind of creature with like a tentacle arm and like another one that was like a crab claw. And they're doing all this crazy stuff. And I was just sitting there being choked for like 10 rounds of combat. And I didn't die. Like I just didn't die. And so this is the point that I'm saying, like, it's not as lethal as you might think it is. It's actually not lethal. And that when I didn't die, that wasn't even people trying to heal me. I saved my death save, and then like I got a chance to gain back some hit points and things like that, right? It was like a weird situation. But more of the story is it's not lethal. So those are my 6 reasons for why Dungeons and Dragons is not my favorite system, and so that's why I give it 1 thumb up. I do believe there are better ways to handle it. I did tell you that Absolute Tabletop Harbinger version of like special abilities and leveling up is much cooler. And in general, I think combat should be an interactive thing, which is why Maximum Apocalypse is a lot more interactive. Or Beta Red, where like it's like you have to beat a difficulty number that is predetermined for your action to do damage to the person, and then you succeed on that, you hit. So then you just roll your damage, and then that person has to deal with that damage, right? And then they have ways of mitigating that. And that's a different way of doing combat than just I'm going to hit you, and then you hit me, and then I hit you, and then you hit me, and then I hit you, and then you hit me, and then eventually you die. That's boring. So that's it. So that's a 49-minute video in which I talk about a game that I don't like that much. I don't dislike it. I'll play Dungeons and Dragons with people as long as it's not in Faerun. Please don't invite me to your table to play Forgotten Realms. Let's do something else. If you're gonna actually play some Dark Sun, yeah, definitely message me. I am down to play Dark Sun all the time. Dark Sun is a cool setting. All right, so that's it for me. I'll leave this to you. This is a very long video, so have a great day. I hope that this information that you actually got to the end of this video. If you didn't, great. If you did, you get the special award of me giving you a thumbs up. Let me know that you made it to the end of the video somehow, some way, and I don't know. I'll figure out some way to get you some kind of cool thing. Maybe even just invite you to a game session in which I do something cool for you and your friends. So that's it. I will talk to you guys later. Check me out on Patreon. Do all that other stuff. I'm shamelessly shilling myself now because I need to support this gaming development stuff that I do. All right, that's it. I will talk to you later.